start? Your Excellency, dear guests, dear colleagues, and above all our dear lecturer today. Before I start, I have one introductory highlight, if I may say, thing for the colleagues, but generally, I'm really glad that we are spreading our community and that I can greet new colleague into our institute, Mr. Strahinja Obrenović, who is at PhD in Faculty of Political Sciences, dealing with international relations, are actually from today joining our crew, and I hope that will continue to work in the future well. So this is really important for us. As you know, we couldn't employ younger people and colleagues, actually, so we all got retired slowly. And now I'm really happy that with Strahinja we got like 5th, 6th already young colleague that can really contribute to us in the future. So again, this is a great opportunity to, let me say, connect with them, that we are starting our year, intellectual year this year with something that is connected with international relations, and I'm really happy that somehow, by chance it came out, we got very interesting lecture, and this is our friend Dr Umut Uzer from Technical University at Istanbul. And I'm really glad that I can, first of all, greet here his wife, that has been recently in Belgrade from August, September, in a position of Minister Counselor in Embassy, Turkish Embassy, and welcome to Belgrade. And of course, His Excellency, don't take me for, having lady first, Mr. Tanju Ciler, His Excellency Ambassador of Republic of Turkey in Serbia. So actually I will not take a lot of time. Mr. Umut Uzer is, let me say, younger but very well-known academic figure, intellectual in Turkey. He's published several books, including 2 in good international framework, of which the last one is, I think it's somewhere there, so we could show that. Sorry, can I get it? Okay, please. This is actually a book from 2016, published with Utah University Press, and it's called An Intellectual History of Turkish Nationalism Between Turkish Ethnicity and Islamic Identity. And today's lecture, the whole idea of what we wanted to ask Umut to give us some presentation is following the lines that he's been working upon, and these are, let me say, internal debates about Turkish identity within the Turkey and intellectual history, which is becoming, as you know, more and more interesting and important in many ways for international scholars, but also for us who are following debates and, of course, increase the influence of Turkey in the region, but also in connections with Europe and so on. So I will not take more time. My colleague Stevan Gajic, who is editing our tribune, will moderate. And I just really want to express our gratitude once more to Umut for accepting this invitation in a very fast way, and I hope that we'll continue to see him even in the other occasions and maybe some conferences that we're going to work upon in the future. Thank you very much, and please stand.
I would once again like to greet you all and Dr. Uzer for being our guest. And today's lecture will deal with the emergence of the Turkish national identity. It will be about the transition from the Ottoman multi-ethnic society towards the Turkish national identity. And I think that this topic is very closely connected to this geography as well, because we were all part of what used to be called in the 19th century the Eastern question. So the emergence of Turkish identity also influenced the emergence of many other identities, both in the Balkans and in the Middle East. So I'm hoping and I'm sure that we all share this feeling for a very good lecture. The floor is yours. One more thing, the rules of engagement, as they say, are that you will speak from 45 minutes up to an hour maximum, and then there will be time for questions and answers.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Georgic, for the kind invitation. Ambassador Bingic, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's a true pleasure to be here in Belgrade. As you say, our common history, I think, makes the topic much more relevant and I hope more interesting for this geography. I think most of you have seen the book. If not, I can pass it around. I think it was in the back. It was published almost 3 years ago. It's a culmination of my postdoctoral study, which I started in the United States and completed in Turkey. I've been dealing with the issue of nationalism for many years. I always found the question of who are we, what is a nation, to be very interesting, and there are obviously rival forms of nationalities, identities, even within the same country, and the same applies for Turkey as well. Not only back in the 19th century, but even so in the 21st century. I was never convinced by the argument that nationalism is a passing phenomenon. At least even to this day, we see it to be very relevant in the Balkans, in the Middle East, even in Western Europe or in the United States. I mean, you look at identity to be very important, and nationalism, even though certain countries did not pronounce the word nationalism. For instance, the United States Americans usually did not use that word, but now we see President Trump using the term nationalism, and I found that to be very interesting as well. So it is definitely relevant in this age of globalization. It can be a defensive mechanism. It can give you meaning in your life, but it can also turn into racism, and that's something I think we should probably work against. But I always believed, contrary to most of my professors, that nationalism was not a bad phenomenon. It doesn't have to be racism. It can be something positive related to your history, studying your language, your culture, which can be a positive development for yourself personally, as a society, and even contribute to globalization with your part of culture. But I think most of my professors in Turkey and in the United States believed the phenomenon to be a bad, almost like a sickness. So that's the difference of opinion, obviously. So I would argue that Turks are latecomers to nationalism because, as the famous historian Bernard Lewis said, Turks submerged their identity much more than even other Muslim peoples. They associated more with Islam, and they've almost forgotten their national identity. I mean, this can be debated. You might agree. There's no exact answer to this, but this is what Bernard Lewis argues, and personally I do agree with that. And usually it is argued that the word Turk was had negative connotations of the Ottoman Empire. To some extent, or maybe to a large extent, that was true, but it wasn't totally. I mean, the Turkish identity wasn't totally non-existent. It was more latent. It wasn't manifest in the Ottoman Empire. And of course, when we look at history, I don't think we can talk about nationalism, but we can talk about national consciousness. I mean, Ivo Banats also says that in history we have national consciousness, but it's not the same as nationalism. So if we want to focus on nationalism in the case of Turkey, we need to come to the 19th century or the late 19th century and take into context both the text and the context. I mean, in the book I focus more, it's an intellectual history. As Dr. Georgic said, I focus more on the texts of Turkish nationalists, and the context is always there, it's always relevant, it's very important actually, because intellectual production or academic production is not undertaken in a void. I mean, there is the larger historical and political developments, very relevant, but in the book I focus more on the text, and as the text and the context mutually constitute each other. I think if we study intellectual history, we have to keep that in mind. But the focus is more on the ideational world and its interrelationship with the material world in the case of Ottoman Turkey. So if we want to look at the emergence of Turkish nationalism, I see three important developments or three important factors that sort of led to the rise of Turkish nationalism. And as I just mentioned, I think the political developments, especially in the 19th century, but also started before, in the case of independence movements among Serbs, among Greeks, Albanians, and later on the Arabs, I think and the loss of territory on the part of the Ottoman Empire is very important in the rise of Turkish nationalism. In a sense, I would argue, this territorial losses, this lack of common identity among the peoples of the Ottoman Empire, which was obviously a multinational empire, sort of discredited both Ottomanism and Islamism in the 19th and the 20th century. So the political developments are the most important, I think, leading to the rise of Turkish nationalism. But the second factor that contributed to the rise of Turkish nationalism are the academic and linguistic and historical studies conducted by European, Russian, and also Turkish scholars. In a sense, discovering that there existed pre-Islamic, pre-Ottoman Turkish history, and writing on them books on Turkish language, on Turkish history that existed, as I said, before the Ottoman times, and even before the Islamic times. So the pre-Ottoman and the pre-Islamic history was a new opening for the intellectuals in the understanding of their history. Of course, we have to keep in mind, and I'm reminding myself as much as you, that just because a book was published or an article was published, it became very popular. As we know, academic books never become bestsellers, and that's okay, I think. I mean, I remember one book review on this book said, I mean, he praises the book and everything, but it was very academic, he said. I think he meant boring. But that's okay, because, I mean, I never tried to write a bestseller. I don't think I can write a bestseller. And that's all right. I mean, we should exaggerate the influence of a certain publication, and I'm talking about ideological, mostly, publications, and I'll give the example. I mean, I don't want to give too many names. I promise that. I don't know if I can keep that promise. But let's think about Yusuf Akçura, also known as Akçurin, from Kazan, Russia. Right? I mean, he published this article, Three Styles of Politics, and focuses on Ottomanism, Islam, and Turkish nationalism. Which policy shall we conduct? And he wrote like as an Ottoman. I mean, he came from Kazan, but he was a pan-Turkist, he was a Turkish nationalist. Later, under Atatürk, he became the president of the Turkish Historical Association, Yusuf Akçura. But he wrote like an Ottoman, from the perspective of an Ottoman. How can we save the state? Is Ottomanism acceptable, or is Islamism, or is Turkish nationalism? I mean, some people have a tendency, including myself, to call this the political manifesto. It sounds good, of Turkism. But actually it wasn't. He doesn't give a clear answer, even though in retrospect, in his future activities, you can see that he was a Turkish nationalist. In that article, he doesn't answer the question which policy is the best, because they all have advantages and disadvantages. So he lays them all out. But more important to the point, just because that was published doesn't mean that Turkish nationalism became hegemonic in Turkey or anywhere else, or in Kazan or in the Caucasus. In fact, I would argue, contrary to many people, that among the Young Turks, right, the Committee of Union and Progress, which ruled the country more or less between 1908 to 1918, I wouldn't argue that they were Turkish nationalists, as some people argue. Turkish nationalism was only one current among Islamism, Ottomanism, Westernism, positivism, and also local national identities, be it Arab nationalism or Albanian nationalism. So it was not hegemonic; it was one of the currents. I would even argue it wasn't even the hegemonic ideology among the other ideologies. I think it was one competing ideology among others. But that's debatable. Some historians argue that the Young Turks were Turkish nationalists, and some people, like Carter Findlay or Michael Reynolds, argue they were not. And I tend to agree with them. Whereas people like Şükrü Hanioğlu argue, yes, they were Turkish nationalists. But that's a different debate, obviously. So what did people find in pre-Islamic or pre-Ottoman Turkish history? There was this exuberance, military victories, and they felt liberated from the immediate history of political failures and territorial losses, which has been going on for many centuries. So political failures, they found a new, more pristine, more heroic age. And it was a sort of escapism, of course. I mean, but still, it was liberating for many people, I would argue. So I talked about political developments, I talked about linguistic and academic and historical studies, and the third influence on the emergence, on the advent of Turkish nationalism is the immigration of highly educated Turks or Turkic peoples from the Russian Empire. I do call them as Turks because they call themselves as Turks, from Crimea, from Caucasus, from Kazan, right, the contemporary capital of Tatarstan within Russia, and to a lesser degree from Central Asia. I mean, it's a different topic, but when you look at the Turkic peoples of the Tsarist Russia, the more educated or people who were closer to nationalism were more in Crimea and the Caucasus and Kazan, probably related to the economic development in these regions, whereas Central Asia was less developed. But that might be a different debate. And so they have contributed to the consolidation of nationalist thought in Turkey. Most of them were veterans of Russian politics. They were highly educated in Russia or in France, in Switzerland, and elsewhere. And I have to name a few names because they are very important. I've already mentioned Yusuf Akçurin from the Kazan region, as I said. Sadri Maksudi Arsal, also from Kazan, also known as Sadrettin Maksudov. Zeki Velidi Togan, he was from Bashkiria, Bashkurt, right, neighboring region of Tatarstan. Ahmet Ağaoğlu from Azerbaijan, Ahmet Agayev, known as Ahmet Agayev. And Hüseyinzade Ali Turan, also from Azerbaijan. I've recently published an article on Hüseyinzade Ali Turan. So these were very important people, as I said, fully mastered, having mastered numerous languages, including Russian and Western languages, and in addition to Turkish and their own Turkic languages as well. They were exposed to Pan-Slavism, and I don't want to say it's just a reaction to Pan-Slavism, but it was definitely important. They were educated, some of them were in Russia. So Pan-Turkism seemed logical for them, not only for the unification of Turkic peoples within Russia, also throughout the world. So most of them were, if not all of them actually, at least the names I've given, were Pan-Turkists. And they have also contributed to the rise of Turkish nationalism within Turkey, number one, and number two, they have all supported Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. Of course they had their differences, as you know, Zeki Velidi Togan, he had a different opinion of the Turkish historical thesis that was developed by Atatürk. And in fact, it was him, and he served as a president of the Bashkirs at one point in time during the Bolshevik Revolution. I mean, I'm not sure if it's the correct term, but he was known as president of the Bashkirs, and Atatürk is said to have said to him that two presidents sitting at the same table is just too many. So Zeki Velidi said, I should probably leave, and Atatürk said, it's a good idea. They had differences of opinion. I think he wanted a more academic perspective as far as the Turkish historical thesis that was developed in the 1930s in Turkey. But whatever the reasons, most of them gave support to the Atatürk Kemalist regime. Yusuf Akçurin, as I said, he was the president of the Turkish Historical Association. And the others served as academics, like Sadri Maksudi. And Sadri Maksudi is actually the father of the first female Turkish diplomat, Adile Ayda. So I think these are the three important processes: political developments, scholarly studies, and the arrival of Turkic peoples, Turkic intellectuals and politicians to Turkey, who had the academic skills, who had the intellectual skills, and who had the organizational skills to contribute to this idea. Of course, there were Turkish nationals coming from within the Ottoman Empire, and I'll talk about them, the most important of which is obviously Ziya Gökalp. And how were these nationalist ideas spread? Of course, as in all countries, through books, publications, journals, and associations. So this intellectual and popular production was important in this spread of the nationalist ideology in Turkey. And when we look at these publications, some of them are quite academic, some of them are ideological, and some of them are probably both, right? I mean, there are the elements of both ideological and economic and academic impact. And we just cannot call them purely intellectual. And when you look at these people, I mean, their grasp of history and languages are quite fascinating. Even Ziya Gökalp, I mean, he never had a university degree, but he was an autodidact, right, self-educated man. He mastered French, and he knew Arabic and Persian. And his interest with academic studies was rather impressive, Ziya Gökalp. Even non-nationalists in Turkey were sometimes impressed by Ziya Gökalp because of his, association with French political thought and all that. Again, let's go back again to the Russian Empire a little bit, because I also want to mention another figure, Ismail Gasparov, also known as Gasprinsky, the publisher of the Tercüman newspaper, interpreter, known as interpreter. He was also, well, he was a Crimean Tatar, but he saw himself obviously as a Turk, and he believed in the unity of language, work, and ideas. And he was instrumental in establishing reformist schools, Cedid, Usul Cedid, reformist schools within the Russian Empire. So what were the commonalities of these people? I mean, Ismail Gasparov, Yusuf Akçura, Ziya Gökalp, of course they had their differences of opinion, even personal differences. And Zeki Velid Togan, he was also attacked at the Turkish Historical Congress for having promoted Bashkir or Bashkurt sort of nationalism, but was more political and personal than real. But what were the commonalities among all these Turkish nationalists? I think they were all Westernists in a sense. They believed in Western science, enlightenment. They believed in the equality of women. And we see this very clearly. Sorry? For instance, Ahmet Agayev published in 1904, I believe, in Tbilisi, in Russian language, about women. So that is quite early and quite revolutionary in the Islamic world. Ziya Gökalp specifically talked about gender equality and also equality among nations. These are some of the commonalities between the nationalists, as modernists, secular, and also critical of the clerical class. Okay, some people in the Islamic world, there is no clergy. Well, I'm not so sure, but at least very critical. Also in Azerbaijan, we see many figures who were critical of the schism between the Shia and the Sunnis, and also the influence of the clergy. This book, Hopokname, I forgot the author, but he's very critical of the clerical class there. So nationalism, obviously, equality for women, gender equality, very specifically expressed by many individuals, as I said, Ziya Gökalp and Ahmet Ağaoğlu. They were revolutionary, or at least reformers. They wanted to change their societies, make their countries more Western, more proud, stronger. And it should probably be emphasized, and maybe it's just self-evident, but Turkish nationalism emerged at a time when the Russian and the Ottoman Empire's collapse was imminent. They were definitely losing ground. What else did they have in common? Emotions. The emotions are, I think, very important. I don't feel qualified to analyze, psychologically, this importance of emotions. I think it's more political psychology, but it's definitely important. Love, fear, compassion. These feelings are very important. These emotions are very important in understanding nationalism. I think, this feeling of being wronged in history. Make the country stronger again. And love towards the country, and love towards your people. These are very important emotions, and should be analyzed by someone, probably a political psychologist or whatever expertise is required to analyze these ideas. But I can just mention them. I can't go out, I think, any deeper than that, rather than pointing them out. So a few turning points. 1897. I mean, it's always helpful to find some turning points. Whether they're relevant can be debated. Because these processes are a culmination of long historical structures, but for the sake of clarity, I think they do help look at certain landmarks, certain turning points. And in 1897, there was the Ottoman Great War. First, the Cretan rebellion in Crete, right? And there, Mehmet Emin Yurdakul, a poet from the Beşiktaş neighborhood of Istanbul, from humble background, he wrote a poem saying, "I'm a Turk, my religion and my race are sublime." So I mean, you might say, okay, so what? But I mean, it was quite revolutionary to declare himself a Turk at that point. It wasn't totally non-existent, but the Turkishness wasn't that obvious for many people. And you see this in certain novels, even in the 20th century. What is your identity? Well, sometimes people ask. They will probably say Muslim, or they'll tell you about their hometown. Or even some politically affiliated might say Ottoman. They might, but Turkish would probably come later. So Turkishness wasn't that obvious at that point in time, even much later, even up into the 1920s and 30s. So when he declared to be I'm a Turk, that was a rather revolutionary statement. And he was praised by Turkish nationals like Gasprinsky, but also praised by Orientalists. This Professor Gibb from Britain praised his simple Turkish, very pure Turkish, and he praised them for, the Turkish nation had waited for you for centuries. So very different people praised this guy, Mehmet Emin Burdakul, and obviously he also influenced Atatürk with his ideas. So again, looking at the late 18th century and the early 20th century, we have the multiplicity of identities. I mean, there's the Ottoman identity, okay, but that's more political, it's more territorial, civic identity. There's ethnic identities, national identities, religious identities, but it's not, they don't have to be mutually exclusive. You look at somebody like Şemsettin Sami from Fresher. I believe Fresher is in Albania, am I correct? Fresher. Okay, he was Albanian, but with his publications, a Turkish dictionary, he had this double identity. He was Albanian, he was Turkish Ottoman. And other people like Abdullah Cevdet, one of the young Turks, he had a Kurdish identity, he had an Ottoman identity. Or Sati al-Husri, right? He was Arab, but he was also Ottoman. So they were not mutually exclusive at that point in time. Yes, you belong to a certain nation, you were an Arab maybe, but you do not necessarily reject Ottomanism at that point in time. If you read, the famous Lawrence of Arabia, right? T.E. Lawrence, in his 7 Pillars of Wisdom, he says, he complains from Egyptians, like he says, well, most of the Egyptians are, Turcophiles, they're pro-Turkish. So the Arab identity in Egypt was not crystallized until the 1930s. Many people had different identities, Ottoman, Egyptian. There was even the movement of Pharaonicism, right? We are Pharaonic, we're not Arabs. But that changed, I think, in the 1930s. So identities were still fluid at this point in time, even until the 1920s and 30s. But still, of course, I didn't talk much about it, but we have to emphasize religion and Islam is important as an ethnic marker, even for the time of Atatürk. Because, who's a Turk? Always the question, who's a Turk is usually Turkish-speaking Muslims. And that's what Ziya Gökalp said, what other Turkish nationals said. Atatürk did not say this openly, but to a large extent, I think the new Turk was supposed to be what I call as sociologically Muslim. The non-Muslims were not equal to the Muslims, even in a secular country like Atatürk's Turkey, and I can talk more about them if you have questions about that. So Turkish-speaking Muslims, Ziya Gökalp said, we see this formulation among the common people. Whoever belongs to my religion and whoever speaks my language belongs to my nation. And Ziya Gökalp seemed to have agreed with that. So other turning points, 1897, the Greek-Ottoman War, of course the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913. They were rather traumatic, losing against territories which were ruled by, up until recently ruled by the Ottomans. It was rather traumatic. Losing against Russia is one thing, but this was considered to be more insulting for the Ottoman leaders. And even even Edirne, now Turkey was lost and it was captured back by Enver Pasha, one of the leaders at the time. It was very devastating, and hundreds of thousands of Muslim and Turkish refugees fled to Istanbul, and it was quite visible. The loss was right there on your footstep. And then the War of Independence, 1919 to 1922, contributed to Turkish nationalism. Again, even in 1922, Turkish nationalism was not hegemonic, because during the war, Turkish nationalism was not openly propagated. It was about the motherland, it was about the nation, the country, but Turkishness wasn't that obvious. Islam was, again, an important source of mobilization in the War of National Independence, and Turkish nationalism culminated slowly after that. I just want to mention, if I don't, a few academic works. I talked about academic works, linguistic works, how they contribute to Turkish nationalism without going into much detail. And for instance, one example would be Arthur Lumley Davids, who published in 1832 A Grammar of Turkish Language. But the thing about these books are they're not purely linguistic, they're also emphasis on pre-Islamic or pre-Ottoman Turkish history, heroism to Turkish civilization. These kinds of qualities that were emphasized of the Turks, they did influence Turkish nationalism, influenced Ali Suavi, one of the young Ottomans of the 19th century. And this guy, Arthur Davids, an Englishman, considered Turks as Caucasian, white people, not Mongols. So this has been a debate. Are Turks whites? Are they Asiatic Mongols? Some people say yes, some people say no. And Atatürk seemed to have agreed with that too. That Turks belonged to the white nation, hence they were Europeans, hence they had to become part of the Western world. They were part of the Western world, or however he would put it. Another interesting character was Mustafa Celalettin Pasha. Actually, he was a Polish man. His name was Konstantin Borzecki, and he's the great-grandfather of Nazım Hikmet, the Turkish poet. He came to the Ottoman Empire in 1848. He converted to Islam, and he served the Ottoman army in the Crimean War, in the Crete uprising of 1867, and in Herzegovina in 1875. He was killed in Montenegro, but more related to our topic at hand here, he wrote the book Ancient and Modern Turks, published in 1869 in French. And there he also said Turks are Europeans. Another common theme, right? I mean, Turks are European, are they Middle Eastern? And Atatürk specifically admired this Mustafa Celalettin Pasha. I'm not going to give too many other details, but let me mention Léon Cahen from France. He wrote an Introduction to Asian History in 1896. He talked about the Turanian peoples, people of Turan, Mongols, Turks, Japanese. They were world conquerors. Mentioned Genghis Khan. So he seemed to believe Turks belong to a different category of people rather than the European category. And some Turkish nationalists like this, people like Yusuf Akçay seem to have agreed with him. Another important, maybe if you want to say turning point or an academic discovery, was in 1893, the deciphering of the inscriptions of Orhon in Mongolia. Because they go back to the 8th century, these monuments, these statues or these monuments, they were discovered by the Danish Wilhelm Thomsen. And there, in these monuments, you see the pronunciation of the word Turk going back to the 8th century. So that was rather impressive for Turkish nationalists, the fact that the word Turk was used back in the 8th century. Of course, in Mongolia, that's where, well, Inner Asia, where Turks originated, right? We have many other names, Ahmet Vefik Pasha and Süleyman Efendi from Buhara. They've written on the Turkish language. The interesting is, they both considered the Turkish, they talked about the commonality of the Turkish language. So what existed was an Ottoman dialect in the Ottoman Empire. So it wasn't a separate language. Or Süleyman Efendi talked about Çağatay language and the Ottoman Turkish. So they all believed in linguistic unity, and hence political unity would come after that. Among young Ottomans, so when I say young Ottomans, we're talking about the group of people before young Turks, people like Namık Kemal and Ali Suavi. They were not Turkish nationalists, but the fact that they talked about the motherland, the concept of vatan, love towards the country, liberty, were sort of influential in among young Turks and people that came after the young Turks. And their patriotism was more Islamic and more Ottoman. But as a result of these developments, in the Constitution of 1876, the fact that the official language was called Turkish was also interesting. It wasn't called Ottoman, it wasn't called anything else. It was called Turkish. So we see the crystallization of Turkish national consciousness in the late 19th century, but with never becoming hegemonic, because as rulers of a multinational empire, you simply cannot pursue a nationalistic ideology at the expense of other peoples. And again, at this point in time, in 1875, 1878, we have a number of newspapers, some of them calling themselves as Turkish newspapers. So again, I mean, it might seem obvious, but the fact that they need to emphasize it, I think it makes it manifest that it wasn't at all clear that the identity was Turkish. With the Balkan Wars, I would argue, I think it was the end of Ottomanism, Ottoman identity as a territorial civic identity that would unite all peoples, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish. I think it became rather obvious that it did not work out. among certain, if you read the memoirs of certain officers who fought in the Balkan Wars, they seem to have been particularly disappointed in the Albanians. Because, Albanians, well, some of them, or most of them, I suppose, are Muslim. They were quite visible in the Ottoman Empire, in the upper echelons as soldiers, as bureaucrats. But the fact that most of them did not speak Turkish, they were rather cool towards the Turkish army or the Ottoman army. They feel very disappointed. People like Kazım Karabekir or the playwright Ömer Seyfettin, he's very much also disappointed in this failure of the Ottoman ideology, and especially among the Albanians, the fact that they did not embrace this identity or ideology full-heartedly. And maybe the World War I discredited Islamism. I mean, that was another trauma, but because of the fact that the Arab uprising by Sharif Hussein. Of course, again, we have to keep in mind that not all Arabs rose up against the Ottoman Empire, but it was rather traumatic, and to this day, many Turks believe, the Arabs stabbed us in the back, that kind of narrative. But again, when you look at T. Lawrence, you see, not all Arabs were against the Ottoman Empire, and many Arabs did serve in the Ottoman army. Maybe they had to, but still, it wasn't that clear. But still, it was a big trauma for Turkey, the World War I, I believe in the Islamic solidarity, because after the Balkan Wars, the country was mostly an Islamic country, having lost most of its European territories. But that was another important turning point, I would argue. How much time?
You have 15 minutes.
Okay. Since our time, let me talk a little bit about the organizations. I talked about newspapers and let me talk about the organizations. There was the Turkish Society established in 1908 after the Young Turk Revolution, but more importantly, the Turkish Homeland and Turkish Hearth, Türk Ocağı, Turkish Hearth, established in 1911. They were rather influential. And in the Turkish Homeland Society, for instance, it was established by 3 Ottoman Turks and 3 Russian Turks. So we see a good balance and the influence of those emigres in the Ottoman Empire. But you've got to keep in mind, when I say Turkish nationalism was not hegemonic, not only these organizations were established, which were obviously Turkish nationals, and they had relations with the Young Turks, no doubt, but also other nationalist clubs were established by Greeks, by Armenians, by Albanians, by Circassians, and many others. So, because of the existence of liberty, and in Turkish historiography, the 1908 Young Turk Revolution is known as the Declaration of Liberty, right? Because of the existence of liberties, we see many nationalities establishing their own clubs, associations, not necessarily separatist, I mean, at least not openly, but emphasizing their national and ethnic and cultural difference from Turks and from others. At the Turkish Hearth, many of these Turkish nationals later on joined Atatürk and supported the Republican regime, which was established in 1923. And to conclude, let me say a few words about Ziya Gökalp. I mean, we like these words, calling him father of Turkish nationalism, okay, he was just one among many, okay, maybe the most influential. He came from Diyarbakir, and it seems rather ironic or surprising for many people because Diyarbakir is a predominantly Kurdish city. But and I have an article on this, his identity, Ziya Gökalp never saw himself as a Kurd, but he says, I believe in cultural nationalism, I don't believe in racism. But even if I were a Kurd or an Arab, it would not have mattered because, what is important is a commonality of culture or common education. But he was rather adamant saying that I'm not Kurdish, and he gave some examples. So that's an interesting point. But some people just call him Kurdish. That's problematic because he specifically answered that question. And he said, okay, it doesn't matter, but I'm not. We probably have to take his word, and I think it was a big deal. But he's quite an impressive individual. I mean, he went to Salonika when it was still part of the Ottoman Empire, and the headquarters of the Young Turks, the Committee of Union and Progress, was in Salonika anyways. And that was the European scene. That was the only European scene, and also Istanbul if you consider it. But he was really self-educated in French, and the French thinkers. Basically, he was a pan-Turkist himself, but he was not racist. And none of these peoples, and none of these ideologues that I've mentioned, I don't think I've seen any of them as racist. And I've also written on racism in this book. That comes later. It was more a small group of people who advocated racism. People like Atsız, and you can see more in the book or my articles. But for Ziya Gökalp and for many others, it was, I mean, yes, there was Turkish nationalists, yes, there was pan-Turkism, but pan-Turkism doesn't have to be racist. I mean, there is no requirement that these two should go hand in hand. He talked about cultural nationalism. But what about the place for non-Muslims? Can they be Turks? Probably not. I mean, at least they don't address this question too much. But again, just as I say, Muslim and Turkish. And probably that's why in Republican Turkey, non-Muslims never became fully equal. I mean, there is no law against it, but in practice, in the bureaucracy, for instance, non-Muslims could not be represented as officers. Again, there was no law, but in practice that was the situation. Whereas in the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, we have numerous non-Muslims serving in the foreign service. I was thinking about Konstantin Musurus Pasha, who served as the ambassador of the Ottoman Empire in London for 40 years. And he's not just one exception, there are many others, obviously. Ziya Gökalp had very interesting ideas. He had a dichotomy of culture and civilization. He was adamant that Turks should protect their national culture, but civilization was international. And he probably meant mostly technology and social scientific methods, which can be adopted from the West. He was totally okay with that. And also on a cultural note, he said that there was nothing wrong with enjoying exotic cultures, but he also included the West. I mean, there was nothing wrong with, enjoying European like opera and that kind of thing. So he was not a rigid or kind of person in that sense either. I said he believed in pan-Turkism. First, he emphasized the unification of Turkey, then unification of all Western Turks, or Oğuz Turks, and then Turanism, which entailed unification of all Turkic peoples. Some people understand Turanism to be unification of all Turanian peoples, but in the case of Turkey, Turanism mostly meant pan-Turkism. I can talk more about that if you want. He also emphasized Turkification, Islamization, and modernization, but it was mostly in Turkification and modernization that were important. And I believe him to be a precursor of Kemalism. Yes, he had differences of opinion. He did not support purification of the Turkish language as much as Atatürk did, but you've got to keep in mind he died in 1924, before all these reforms and revolutions were undertaken by Atatürk. So we have to keep that in mind. And the culture-civilization dichotomy did not exist in Atatürk. Yes, Atatürk was very nationalistic, but he believed in the civilization to be complete. So he had a more holistic approach to civilization. So these were different. But interestingly, Ziya Gökalp was the person who advocated the change of the call of prayer from the minarets to be Turkish. In the Islamic world, it's always Arabic, right? And he called for that, and that was quite revolutionary. And in fact, Atatürk implemented this. Between 1932 to 1950, the call to prayer in Turkey was in Turkish. So there's an interesting relation. I mean, was he influenced by Gökalp? Probably. But then it was changed back to Arabic in 1950 with the advent of democracy in Turkey. So there are strong similarities and also differences. And he was quite, Ziya Gökalp was quite against the monarchy, against the Sultan, and anti-monarchist ideas, so that was probably similar as well. And with the coming of Atatürk, that's when Turkish nationalism became hegemonic. Maybe not immediately in 1920, but gradually in a few years. Definitely in the 1930s, where a very strong form of Turkish nationalism was advocated, with the Turkish historical thesis, with the Turkish language, sound language theory, calling all civilizations, all cultures having emanated from Turkishness. So that was a very strong Turkish nationalism under Atatürk, and also very strong Westernism. That's when Turkish nationalism became hegemonic. Not in the Ottoman times, not under the Young Turks. It was a gradual process, no doubt, but it was only then it became nationalistic. Okay, there was an element of focusing on Turkish history, in a sense sidestepping, sort of jumping all the way to Central Asia, sort of forgetting about the Ottoman Empire in the first decade or two. There was this negation of the Ottoman Empire. But in the 1950s, again with the coming of democracy, I think that was sort of making the peace with the Ottoman history. Ottoman history was accepted once again by most of the people. It was probably never forgotten among the people, but even in the leadership, even among the intellectuals, I think the Ottoman Empire was accepted, and that's how the gradual process became. But there was a big experimentation of creating a new Turk, and that's what Atatürk tried to do. In a sense, trying to go back, as I said, to Central Asia, going back to the Anatolian civilizations, called often to be Turkish, the Hittites, the Sumerians. And I think the main objective was sort of forgetting the Ottoman past, but it wasn't possible. It wasn't possible for most Turks, it wasn't possible for other peoples who still associated the Ottoman Empire with Turkey. But I think I want to conclude with these words saying it's an ideological odyssey of an idea of Turkish nationalism. It still exists, obviously. It was rather influential. You cannot explain everything with Turkish nationalism because there are other ideologies, there are other competing identities, but it definitely had an important impact on Turkish history, Ottoman history, and even in contemporary Turkish politics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I must say this was a very interesting and very fascinating lecture, and if you write in the same fashion as you speak, I'm sure your book is very far from being boring. I've personally learned a lot, and there are a million questions that came to my mind, but I cannot discriminate the people who came here, so that's why I will ask my questions or share my thoughts at the end. So please now I would like to call the audience to raise questions.
Thank you for a fascinating lecture. I'm Umut Uzer from the Institute of European Studies, and you mentioned a lot of names in your lecture which I learned about. It was actually very interesting to me. But I was wondering whether you can mention or whether there are some names of the Slavic Muslims from the former Ottoman Empire who also influenced Turkish nationalism, from Bosnia and so forth. Because it would be interesting to see what people from this region, if any, influenced the development of Turkish nationalism. Thank you.
Well, I can't think of any. Can anyone help me? I'm sure there must have been, because in Ottoman times, you know, the bureaucrats usually had a nickname, and it was usually, or sometimes, ethnic. Gürcü, Georgian, Boşnak. Boşnak was quite common, I think, in Ottoman times, as far as I know. But among the nationalists, I mean, some of them came from Greece or Balkans, but they were not Slavic. They were ethnic Turks, like what was the Abdullah Supi Tanrıöver. He was the head of the Turkish Association. His grandparents were expelled from Greece, and you know, some of them were massacred and that kind of thing. But so when you say you mostly talk about Muslims, right? Is that what?
Can I reformulate it?
Absolutely.
Just to make it more clear, maybe what was the place of the Slavic Muslim people who belonged to the Ottoman Empire in the new national building process in Turkey? Was there a place for them, or were they excluded, as you said, that maybe Christians were not a part of the new identity?
I don't think it, because it was. I mean, it was secular Muslim, the new identity, very much. It's what I say, sociological Muslim. I mean, even if, okay, so they did not speak Turkish, maybe some of them, okay. But they became part of the nation. But I don't know specifically about that. I mean, I don't see a discrimination, and I don't see a major problem. But I know today, people of Albanian origin or people of Boşnak origin, they seem to be quite either nationals or, I mean, they're part of the society or whatever. I mean, maybe some of them are more conservative, I don't know, but they don't seem to be discriminated. They became fully part of the society as far as I know. But specifically, I don't know if they faced any difficulties. We know more about the population exchange between Turkey and Greece. They had difficulties, obviously. I mean, some of them had Turkish as their mother tongue, some of them did not, like from Crete. So that was problematic. But specifically, I don't know. I don't think it was an issue.
very much. I'm Dr from this institute. I have one question for you. You said in a certain way that Turkish identity, or just that name, Turkish, was put on side during the period of Ottoman Empire. How can you explain, or how do you see the fact that Serbian people from here, during that period, the period of Ottoman Empire, presence here, called all people who believe in Islam Turks? And for example, I can give you a sentence of our famous language reformist Karadzic, who said that whoever believes in Muhammad as saint, he is a Turk. Or Njegoš, or some other authors we had during that period. So it looks like in that period, I actually don't know that any Serb who was educated called someone as Ottoman or used that phrase. That's all.
They would use Turk, right?
Yes.
Yes, generally.
Okay.
I'm not sure for Bulgarians maybe, or maybe, but the whole area where actually Serbian was, I mean, I think it's even with the Croats and with the whole people around, the only reference is like Turks.
So the Ottomans, Turks, right?
Yeah, never used as an Ottoman or
Just
Turks.
Okay. I mean, you know, of course, Turkish is an ethnic identity, but also it's a territorial civic identity. But in the case of Turks being Muslims, I mean, Bernard Lewis also writes about this. There was an expression in English. He turned Turk. He became a Turk meant he became a Muslim in Europe. So I mean, there's a close association being Turkish meant being Muslim, and same in the Ottoman Empire, and to a large extent. But we can't, I mean, even in certain Western historiography, we see on the maps Turkish Empire. But again, it wasn't exactly a Turkish Empire. It was not that it wasn't a Turkish Empire, it was only partially not a Turkish Empire. But the Ottoman hierarchy, they didn't really see themselves as Turks. The Sultans, okay, there was this association with Turkish history, even though I think it was the 15th century, maybe historians would know better. This association with the Oğuz, the legend of Oğuz, was part of the Turkish sort of, I don't know if you want to say identity, or maybe this legitimacy to the ancient times. But I mean, yes, there was this element of Turkishness, especially in the earlier centuries of the Ottoman Empire. It became more and more Islamic after the conquest of the Middle East, which came after this territory, right? Almost 100 years later, right? More or less. So I mean, yes, there was this association of Turkishness and Islam, even in Europe, obviously, but the Turkish identity was never dominant. It was a multinational empire. I mean, I can understand what you're saying. Even in Western Europe, it was the same, I suppose. And even today, many people cannot think of a Turk who's not a Muslim, even if you're not religious. I mean, that's how the association goes. Okay, we have the Gagavuz, right, in Moldova, who are ethnically Turks, but they're Christians, but they're small numbers. Unlike the Arabs in the Arab world, of course, we have 10-15% Christians, like in Egypt or in Syria, at least in Syria there were, among Palestinians. I mean, there's nothing strange. An Arab who's a Christian belonging to different, whereas for ethnic Turk and Christians, very limited. We have this group of Karaman, but they're Orthodox, I'm sorry. They're Greeks, Turkish-speaking Greek Orthodox, the Karaman, people from Karaman. But yeah, I can't think of anyone else. The Gagavuz, but they don't live within Turkey. So Turkishness and Islam are so intertwined. Again, it's not about religiosity, but it's about identity. But I even read about the Greeks. One Greek communist was saying in modern times, he was saying in 20th century, he was saying, I'm a communist, so I'm an atheist. But I'm a Greek, so I'm Orthodox. Right? So I mean, so these things, I mean, I think religion is almost always an important component of identity. In Ireland, in Poland, right? Even in the US, very Protestant nation for many years, very Protestant, very anti-Catholic. Okay, that changed, but so I mean, it's always important. But it's interesting what you're saying. And the Bosnian Muslims were known as Turks. Am I right?
Yeah.
Right.
Recently.
Right.
You have like Turkish march of lots of, the famous musical piece which is, Turkish, and that so it was also used all around, you know. So it's very interesting, and I think it's a very good point. That doesn't mean that it was coming from Ottoman, but actually it's interesting why generally Europe was using only expression Turks even after, I don't know, 5 centuries of Ottoman Empire existing as a non-Turkish basically.
It's a very interesting point.
I really do have to express really great gratitude to you for again accepting to come here and preparing in such a fast way, such a concise and very, how should I say, industrious lecture. We really learned quite a lot about this development, which is interesting also from our perspective and from general comparative perspective understanding of development of nationalism as a phenomenon. I had two questions. The first one, probably I will pose you maybe to speak more about that, because what is very interesting actually that generally you have finished somewhere about 20s, as far as I know, slightly just reminding us about some facts that were going in 30s and maybe 50s, but as far as I saw from the book, you go on further. Also, you're mentioning Grey Wolves and actually all these developments, even let me say after 50s, after the Second World War. Could you, and I don't want to take another half an hour or something like that, just briefly, how should I say, give us some overview of these internal debates after 50s, after, let me say, the first democratic, you might say, elections and prime minister and so on, because from that time onward until, let me say, last 20 or 15 years, especially during the AKP, what we follow is this very strong internal debates about how today Turkish, and I'm finishing with that, Turkish identity or identity of contemporary Republic of Turkey is in some way, how should I say, swinging between, let me say, defined national identity, but also I think that there are some new moves toward regaining or evaluating this Ottoman Empire for many reasons, not only internal but also because of, let me say, regional influence, very developed and complex identity of the people of the Turkish origin, and so on and so. I think it's very interesting issue. So if you could just enlighten us about this internal perception of contemporary Turkey between, if I could say, Turkish nationalism in the classic way, or some ideas about regaining some of empire, more imperialistic approach in the classic way. I'm referring because Russia has, again, the same internal issue, and some way even we here think that, you know, referring only about the Serbs as a nation restricted to, let me say, what Serbs perceive themselves are today or in the last 50, 60 years, is really just shrinking some of very much bigger and much complex identity which used to include like Serbs of the, let me say, Mohammedan origin, as we used to say, or Serbs Catholic, there were a lot of them, and so on. So that was the first issue. And the second one, what I wanted is when we were mentioning about all those names of people who were mostly educated in the West, or some in Russia, but actually under very strong Western, let me say, nationalist in the way that it was perceived. And when you were describing, actually, Stephen and I exchanged this perception that when you describe those persons, it really resembles to what Freemasons at that times were, which were very influential in creating of national identities and nationalistic identities in the late 19th century, especially in Serbia, also in many ways. So in that sense, you have this sense of what nationalism was westernizing, very enlightenment, oriented toward secularization, toward technical progress, and so on and so on. But on the other hand, what I wanted to ask you is that we know that from the late, actually 90s of the late 19th century until even the First World War, and even after that, German influence was very interesting there. And this these connections between, we know in military, in technical way, also of course this alliance during the First World War, and I think that in many ways it really contributed to not only technical and military development, but in that sense I wanted to ask you if there were some influence of, let me say, German nationalism or German perception of the nation that could be traced. Did you follow some of that within your research? Thank you very much again for really giving us quite a lot of new views of understanding how development of Turkish identity went.
Well, thank you, Misha. I really enjoyed our talk and my talk and our discussion here. It's really I've benefited from it, quite frankly. But to answer your second question, the French influence was more there, like Yusuf Akçura, and not only reading the books, but also having been educated there. I mean, I don't remember reading Hagler influence for it. It was Hagler or in German. So, but I'm very curious about, as far as the later coming of anti-Semitism, whether there was an impact of, say, German, thinkers. I'm not sure. I haven't seen that. But French influence definitely much more there. We can see more specifically towards Ziya Gökalp, but also for Yusuf Akçura and others. And also some of the French writers that I mentioned, but also Russians were important, at least academically or intellectually. Important part of the story of the book is the narrative of the book is how nationalism as an idea has changed from a more modern, secular-looking, gender-neutral or equality for genders to a more conservative, patriarchal form of nationalism in the 1950s. With the coming of democracy, first elections 1946 and 1950, the Republican People's Party has lost power and the Democrat Party has come to power. But hence comes the use of Islamic symbols in Turkish politics as an instrument to mobilize the people, or also maybe to satisfy the needs of the people. As I said, the call of prayer has changed from Turkish to Arabic in 1950, right after the government came to power, with one of these earliest policy changes, and definitely more opening towards conservative masses. And nationalism itself has become, as I said, more conservative, more patriarchal, more positively looking at the Ottoman Empire. So that is a radical change, and I think Turkish nationalism, in one form, in its dominant form, has become conservative nationalism, as I call it in the book. It has become conservative nationalism. Yes, there's also this left nationalism, but I haven't focused too much on that. But mostly the dominant of, what you call the grey wolves, but also other elements in other center-right parties or right parties has become conservative. So that is a radical change even from Ziya Gökalp. Even though Ziya Gökalp talks about Islamization, it's not really, he's more revolutionary in that sense, as far as I said, gender roles and other reforms in the country. And so that is the radical change that has happened. They're known mostly in Germany as grey wolves, as you know, the Nationalist Action Party, which still exists. And that's what the nationalism has come to, I think, in many senses. Of course, there's a lot to say, but did you have anything more specific?
Today, let me say, internal debates, how would you put it, in what sense, in which direction is actually contemporary Turkish perception of identity is going on? It's a bit conservative in that sense, I definitely understand, but this, if I could say, swinging between understanding more like classical Turkish, or like we say, small Turkish in a Western way, if we put it, perception, or more, let me say, pro-Ottoman. Where would you put it?
I think we have elements of both, of all. Of course, Islam is very important, no doubt. Turkishness is there also. But you've got to keep in mind, for instance, Nationalist Action Party's party emblem is the flag of the Ottoman Empire, the three crescents. So it is, and it was one of the nationalists who opposed that back in the 1960s. They said, the party has become Islamic, that kind of thing. But so definitely more Islamic. The Ottoman Empire is perceived more positively in Turkey, I think. But it didn't happen just in the past years. It has been going on since the 50s at least. And I give it another important turning point. Of course, these can all be debated, but in 1953, the commemoration of the conquest of Istanbul, 600 years? 500 years. I think that was an important turning point. By the way, the president and the prime minister at the time, Menderes and Cevher, did not attend those meetings, but still, its Ottoman Empire became more visible and more acceptable ever since the 50s. In the 1980s, we had another, sort of fashion with Ottoman, clothes or Ottoman themes. And today we have a lot of TV shows on the Ottoman Empire. But of course, we have to keep in mind, nobody's talking about re-establishing the Ottoman Empire, nothing like that. But it's also a sort of escapism as well, I think. And sort of looking back at the good old golden age, so to speak, I think. So it's there's Islam, there's Ottoman Empire, there's Turkishness, of course. They're all together, and there's also still the Westernism, legally very secular still. So all these elements exist today. And the second constitutional period, as we say in Turkish historiography, 1908 to 1918, is the political laboratory of the Turkish Republic, one Turkish political scientist said back in the day. And it's true, those ideas exist to this day, and which exists since the late 19th and early 20th century, still exist today. But of course we give new meanings to them, I suppose, right? I mean, Islam is very capitalistic today, in Turkey at least. Ottoman Empire, again, maybe more interesting. It can be a positive influence as well. I mean, if Turkey is more interested in the former territory of the Ottoman Empire, maybe more investment, more cultural investment as well, I think that's good, Nobody's talking about reconquest. It's beyond its capability, and nobody's contemplating that either. So this new form of interest in the Ottoman Empire can be something positive, but we got to keep in mind, back in the 60s and the 70s, even certain left novelists wrote about the Ottoman Empire, like Kemal Tahir, right, or later on Atilla İlhan. So it's an important theme, right, the Ottoman past. It's interesting. And Ottoman studies is quite developed, say, even in the United States, so many professors. So I guess it's a very long period. It's still relevant to some extent, obviously. In Israel, they say, we still continue to be system, they say, right, in a sense, different religious communities. So, I mean, it is, but we give different meanings. It's not the same thing, I suppose. And it has become very commercialized as well with the TV shows. Very commercial these days.
Thank you. Thank you. Milan from the Institute here. Historical question, and looking at from the intellectual history point of view, and Balkan nationalists in 19th century, most of them were Christians, Serb, Greek, Bulgarian, that were separatists towards the empire, that have built their states and nations against the empire, so to speak. What is their position in Turkish nationalism in that period? Do Turkish nationalists, I mean, theoreticians, academics who are thinking about it, do they play any role in this horizon? Are they any source of inspiration, or are they just separatists who are part of the crumbling of empire?
Christians, especially.
Well, Christian nationalism in the Balkans, so to speak. Is there any role for them in this Turkish nationalism? How does it relate to those experiences over the 19th and early 20th century?
I think Ottomanism was supposed to unite all individuals belonging to whatever religion. It was a very territorial, civic form of identity. Of course, it did not work. Of course, Muslims didn't like it because now they were supposed to be equal, which was against their worldview. And the Christians didn't want it because they wanted their separate states. Well, okay, not all of them. Maybe that was a gradual process, but some of the intellectuals, and that's how it starts, right? It's never hegemonic initially. So for Christians, I mean, the fact that it didn't work, I think, was obvious after so many centuries of, well, there was inequality, but there was coexistence too, obviously. But in the age of nationalism, a multinational empire could not have lasted. Same with Russia, same with Austria-Hungary, with so many nationalities. And I don't think they had a special place. But even for Albanians, as I said, they were a very important part of the empire, as manpower too. Or Arabs later on. Again, it was never hegemonic, but it was obvious that there were demands for Arabic as equal, or if not the dominant language within the Ottoman territories of the Arab world. So it just wasn't going to work. I think, okay, you could have tried, but even in this age of nationalism, I don't think there was any future, not only for Christians, but even for Muslims. So even the Islamic solidarity did not work. So maybe Atatürk was a reaction to all these as well. Maybe his sort of radical revolution is also maybe a reaction to all that. Putting less emphasis on Islam. But interestingly and ironically, even the secular Turkey was Muslim in the sociological sense, at least even much more so than the Ottoman Empire. Demographically, right, the population of Muslims increased. And also the self-consciousness was, well, secular Muslims. Yeah, we had certain individuals like Agop Dilaçar, who was Armenian, who supported Atatürk. But there were a few people. There was some Jewish members who supported, but it became a very Muslim, secular country, and demographically and even ideologically. So that's an interesting contradiction. The Ottoman Empire and the Islamic Empire was, in a sense, more open for Christian representation. But again, it was a multinational empire. It was this new identity was Turkish and Muslim, even though it wasn't emphasized. It was more implied rather than openly said.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your speech. It was pretty interesting. I'm Miodrag. I'm working for European Trade Union Confederation here in Belgrade. And I have one question. You didn't mention so much a race issue in Turkey during the creation of nation. Race, yes. I remember when in 2011, when there was election campaign or 12, I'm not sure, Erdogan said, oh, the final moment came where our black Turks will overturn white Turks and gain the power. And I was pretty interested about how this thing was created, and as I understood, when the Atatürk Turkish identity was created in the 20s and 30s, there was some kind of obsession of heightening of Turkish nation and creation of some kind of white supremacy theory. I mean, maybe I'm not regretting very well to that issue. And like the whole Turkish upper middle class and upper class was somehow white, like Balkan origins or Turks from the Russian. And does this thing create some kind of historic trauma now so in society? Or I'm coming back to these Erdogan statements. Do you have still this kind of division, like, yeah, you have upper class who came from white background and you have like darker Turks who are living in Anatolia?
Right. I mean, Erik Zürcher, the Dutch expert on Turkey, Erik Zürcher, he's written on the political leadership of the Young Turks and Atatürk, and he says most of them come from the West, but the problem with his conception of West is not only the Balkans, but it's the Balkans, it's Istanbul, also the whole Marmara region and the Aegean. That's a bit problematic, but still, when you look at those numbers, it's 80% or something like that. Yes, it was, I mean, the Young Turks, the heartland of the Ottoman Empire, and then the Young Turks was pretty much Balkans to a large extent. Of course, Istanbul is the capital, but also the Balkans became more the heartland. But of course, Damascus was important in certain areas too. Many people in Turkey, they say, oh, the Ottoman Empire neglected Anatolia. Okay, Ziya Gökalp came from Anatolia, and he was very, very influential. But again, the leadership was mostly, of course, Atatürk from Salonika, obviously, but İsmet İnönü, okay, Izmir, but partially from the eastern areas, his family. In fact, I mean, the leadership also usually comes from the more educated parts, right? I mean, these were the more educated parts. But Atatürk put strong emphasis on the peasants, right? I mean, that was sort of, I suppose, related to the Narodnik movement, maybe. Going back to the people, Ziya Gökalp also, go back to the people, get from them the wisdoms, partially the language, even though they emphasized we should adopt Istanbul form of Turkish. I guess that's understandable too, again. But he sort of praised the common people. And so I'm not so sure that's so relevant. I mean, from within Anatolia, of course, Anatolia was less educated, economically more backward to some extent. Again, but again, it depends on where you look at. If you look at Adana, was developed, or Izmir, again, do you see Izmir as Anatolia? Maybe, maybe not. But the leadership, I mean, if you look at, to a large extent, came from Istanbul and from the Balkans, to a large extent. We might say that, I think. But how relevant is it? I mean, it wasn't a racial thing, really. It was nationalism. Okay, everybody's a Turk, and the peasants are praised. So peasants are mostly come from Anatolia, and the new countries, Anatolia to a large extent. So, right, you have to depend on the common people, but you want to try to make them European. Sort of in a sense, forcing them or encouraging them to listen to Western classical music, wear Western kind of clothes. So that was sort of imposed, obviously, no doubt, wearing a hat. So in that sense, it was when I say radical, it was radical in that sense. It was very excessive because you have to accept Western civilization in its entirety, right? So that was important. So I don't know how much I could address your question, but
Can I have another question, please? I mean, is this trace of race issue still existable? I mean, when you're looking at Turkish TV novellas now, where all media and entertainment things, all actors are kind of having these European features. They're very white, very blondie. I mean, that's this.
No, they're tall and dark. They don't look like Serbs.
No, I don't see they look like Serbs, but really, And you have this arrogant statement about.
It's not a racial issue, it's more a cultural issue, I think he was referring to. It was referring to more cultural, like, yeah, it's not racial, but it's more, yeah, cultural or education-wise, the more urban Turks. Social, yes. That's the white Turks is a rather new term. I think it emerged in the past 10 years or so, or 10, 15 years. It didn't exist before, as far as I know. So it's not racial, it's more cultural. But, I mean, you look at some people like, I don't know, Murat Yıldırım, is that his name? He's quite dark, isn't he?
Yeah.
I mean, but some people are, yeah. So, I guess, I mean, yes, I mean, you want to be European, that's what Atatürk's project, and if you want, you gotta look European, I suppose. But I mean, I don't think it's a racial issue. It was a more cultural, social issue, and ideological maybe. Yeah, absolutely.
Just following with that because of...
I'll say, just before making some conclusion, I would like to say some stuff. First of all, thank you very much for hosting this event. Thank you very much. It was really very interesting for me, and I'm very amazed to hear a lot of questions, and they were really some of them are really very difficult questions, even some of the questions I don't have the answers. But I'm going to make some comments. The first comment is that now these days, yesterday and today, I read a book about a memoir of a Turkish soldier, and it was one of the first memoirs in the Turkish literature. It has been a story of a soldier that has been caught and lived in Austro-Hungarian Empire. He has been caught and taken hostage by the Austrians at the end of, I think it's 1687 or something like this. And he had been taken as a hostage, and he lived in that area. He has been traveling one place to another, and he never, but from today's discussion, I realized that he never called himself a Turk. His own memoir, and he's saying that I'm an Islam, I'm a member of the Muhammad religion, and that's all. But all the others, Austro-Hungarians, Croats, Serbs, it was referring to him as a Turk. So this was really very interesting, very interesting. And then, for example, because he was traveling without any food, anything, and he was trying to reach back to Belgrade, which was under the Turkish Ottoman territory at that time. And he was traveling, one village to another, and they were, greeting him, or the church came, and offering him food and that. And I think, this is also very interesting to realize that the Turks never called themselves Turks in the Ottoman Empire. So it most probably came after after maybe Balkan Wars, and after this ideologically. We discovered our identity later on, maybe the latest, as you say, than the other nations in the Ottoman Empire. This is my first comment. The second comment is that you were talking about the fathers of Turkish nationalism that were coming from Crimea, from Caucasia. I think that one of the reasons is that when the Russian Empire disintegrated and when the new Soviet Union has been established, the Soviets, the communists, they asked from every republic, every nation to be presented for their meetings in St. Petersburg, in Moscow. So that's why, as far as I know, for example, Sultan Gariyev, Zeki Togan, these are all, has some, communist backgrounds as well. So they had to identify themselves with a nation, and this is a Turkish nation, and therefore they have developed most probably these ideas at this time with the communist ideas as well. So there must be a linkage, I think. This is my second comment. Maybe you can, work on it or study on it and think about that. Because Sultan Gariyev memoirs, I read them. I read Zeki Togan's memoirs as well, and they were talking about the communist past and creating an identity. This might be also very interesting. The third thing is that we have already said that during the Ottoman Empire there were a lot of bureaucrats from Christian background, and even the ambassador in Belgrade was an Armenian as well as or a Greek origin. One of the first ambassadors, 1878, after 1878 here, were I mean, to conclude, you know, it was really very interesting, but it's obvious that we have, you know, discovered our identity. You know, the Turkish identity has been, you know, developed mainly during the Turkish Republic. And after Balkan Wars, the Ottoman Empire has lost its 40% of its territory. And the population-wise, because of the migration from Balkans to Istanbul and, you know, western part of Turkey, the population equilibrium has changed. Till the Balkan Wars, half of the population of Istanbul was non-Muslims. But after the Balkans War, it has changed because a lot of people migrated from Balkans. And as regards, you know, the Bosniak or Slavic origin, you know, people from Balkans, I don't know any, you know, philosopher or thinker who are, you know, promoting, you know, Turkish nationalism. I mean, maybe there are, but I don't know. But mainly, it's true to say that they are very active in Turkish state hierarchy. Mainly people from, you know, Balkans origins, Albanian origins. There are a lot of people saying that their forefathers, you know, had migrated from Balkans. That's all what they say, but they do not speak the language. They do not have any, you know, memoirs coming from Balkans, but they know that they are from Balkan origin. So that's the only influence that they have. You know, you can talk about, you know, from Balkans and the Turkish state institutions. Anyhow, that's all. Thank you very much. It was really very interesting. And then I'll give the floor to you.
Thank you. Just before, are you talking about the Janissary memories of the Turkish chronic? Is that of Constantine?
This is a guy called from Temeshvar. Temesh, you know, there's a Romania.
Because I also read another, and I think it's a fascinating book. From Temeshvar. He has been in Temeshvar as a soldier, and he has been caught by the Austrians in Dipola. And then later on, he stayed, you know, 20 years under the Austrian-Hungary territory, trying to get back to Turkey. And this is the first memoirs of known memoirs, as far as I know. And he's called Osman from Temeshvar. It's really interesting. Yeah. You might be interested in this Turkish chronic. It is basically one of the first, let's say, espionage novels, because it's from the 15th century. It is Constantine is his original name. He's a Serb from Kosovo, who became an Ottoman soldier and lived in the Ottoman Empire for 30 years, but then was captured by Poles, I believe, and then he wrote about the life in Ottoman Empire, describing religion, describing the political system and all that. Very interesting. Sorry for my interruption.
By the way, our colleague Sasha Gajic, who just went out, wrote a book
about that. Sorry. Do you want to comment?
No, well, thank you, Ambassador. Very, very interesting points. Yes, I did not look at Sultan Galiev. That should have been important, I suppose. Yes, I mean he's a progress. Yeah, and also supported sort of Pan-Turanian idea. I mean, some people use Pan-Turanianism as unification of all Turanian peoples, including Hungarians. In fact, in Hungary, there was a Turan society. I think maybe still today. Yes. You know, unification. And Hüseyinzade Ali Turan, who was Azerbaijani, he said, "You Hungarians, you are brothers. The Bible and the Quran cannot separate us. We all belong to the same religion." But it was never actively pursued in Turkey. Probably more in Hungary than Turkey. In Turkey, Turanism, to a large extent, meant Pan-Turkism, unification of Turks. I just want to point that out. But thank you for your comments. Very interesting.
Are there any more questions?
One question. I don't know if you
present yourself.
My name is Umut Uzer, I'm a historian, and as I listened to everything you said, I remember one thing from the Middle Ages. I recollected that Byzantines called Hungarians the Turks.
Really?
Back in 9th or 10th century. So that perception goes way back into the Middle Ages.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Thank you. I mean, of course, no doubt. I mean, Turks and Hungarians are related, but I guess distant cousins. I mean, grammatically, their language, but.
And later on, during the 19th century, the Hungarian immigrants who emigrated to the year 1848.
Yes, exactly.
1849, they accepted the Turkish identity, modern identity, and Muslim faith very quickly, and they became very loyal subjects of the Ottoman Empire. Am I right?
I think so, yes. But a group of Poles also came, Polish people, in 1848 after the revolutions. And they established a Polish village outside Istanbul. And to this day, there's a small village called Polonezköy, Polish village. They kept their Christian identity and some of their language, I believe. It's a very nice area. But yes, I mean, some did convert to Islam. I mean, others, I suppose, Hungarians and others. But some Poles kept their. But interestingly, Nazım Hikmet, as I said, his father, great-grandfather comes from that Polish, Mustafa Celalettin Pasha is a Muslim name. But that's an interesting, so I'm sure there were others. I'm not sure about Mehmet Ali Aybar, one of the socialist leaders, might have, I might be wrong in this, some Hungarian connection, I might be wrong in this. But yes, we had some other people. And interestingly, to become a Turk, you have to convert to Islam. Right? That's ironic, but it's, I guess, related to what we've been talking about.
Speaking of 1848, I'd like to draw your attention to another book by Ivan, which is called Ömer Pasha Latas. I don't know if it is translated into Turkish. Ivan is the Nobel Prize winner for language, who also lived with the Ottoman and shared history. Because the book is fascinating. Because Ömer Pasha Latas, as a Serb who converted to Islam, became therefore a Turk, but already as a grown-up person with a formal identity, made a unit that consisted only of mostly Hungarians and Poles, so those who lost in the European second big revolution age, and then they had to flee somewhere, and Turkey was the obvious choice. So they were, as a part of modernization from Istanbul, sent to suppress the actual Muslims, Serbian-speaker Muslims, let's say, is politically correct, in Bosnia, which created such a mess with the identity, because they, as Muslims, felt as being mistreated because of their privileges by Christians, actually, who are only nominally Muslims. Converted just days ago or something like that.
It was rebellion against the Tanzimat, actually, by the
Yes.
local feudals, local babes. And Ömer Pasha Latas was leading, actually, who very recently converted to Islam, actually, but leading mostly Christians, relatively new Islam.
Sent by the Sultan.
Sent by the Sultan, and actually the book is novel, is fascinating, apart from, the searching of identity, and actually it's absolutely, fascinating how he tries to support, to win the support of the local Serbian peasants, by displaying actually that he still has a cross, because he needs their help to suppress the base. It's absolutely, but the book is magnificent, definitely.
Because the layers of identity and their mixture, it's a complete mess. If there aren't any more questions,
I want to go more to, before we exhaust him totally, which is again connected with history of ideas and so on. Speaking about these new developments, Eurasianism, are you familiar with the ideology and development? Because it's very strong, especially in some parts of Russia, Kazakhstan especially. But what about Turkey? Is it relevant? We know that there were Dugin is traveling there, has some friends and so on, but in that sense, especially in, let me say, this searching for different directions of contemporary Turkish foreign politics, which has, certain issues with the EU, with the USA and so on. Is it an attractive position intellectually? Are there any relevant intellectuals who are, let me say, developing some kind of, let me say, Turkish-based Eurasianism as a perspective for foreign politics or identity? And I will not touch you anymore.
Alexander Dugin visited Turkey on many times. His book has been translated into Turkish. He met with some small political parties, one in particular in the past. And I suspect, some people in the military were sympathetic to that, because back in the 1990s, I remember a general at a conference, maybe it was his personal opinions, but still calling for closer relations with Russia and China rather than the United States. And in Turkey, there are certain elements who feel, or maybe the majority in Turkey feel more alienated from the United States today than in the past 10, 20 years. Of course, I mean, Russia obviously is the old, in a sense, rival, you know, losing territory at the expense of the Austrians and the Russians was what happened to Ottoman Empire. But then under the Cold War, of course, again, a major rival. After a small, brief, you know, good relations between Atatürk's Turkey and Soviet Union. Of course, in the 1960s, there was some opening to Russia, getting some credits under the interestingly conservative government of Süleyman Demirel. So, I mean, there were always relations, but I think the relations, the Turkish-Russian relations, were radically transformed in the 1980s onwards. You know, getting natural gas almost 67% from Russia itself, and then in the 90s, the coming of tourism, intermarriage. Of course, Ambassador would know much better because he served in Russia as well. But I think the relations have radically changed in that sense. And now, economic interdependence, investments from both countries is rather different. And this feeling of alienation from the United States, but of course, Turkey is a NATO ally. So Eurasianism, I don't think it was ever too strong as far as now. It was more a small group of people. But it might be more fascinating. But I think people might be aware that Eurasianism might be another name for Russian nationalism. It might be. But yeah, I mean, there are elements who are interested, but I'm not so sure if they're so strong. But I think mutual interest between Turkey and Russia make relations to be more logical today.
So in a sense, what I was thinking, apart from these, let me say, people who cooperate with Durgan and so on, but actually, let me say, some Turkish-based Eurasianism, which would be focused mainly on Caucasus and, let me say, people of Turanian or Turkish origin and so on. In that sense, that I was thinking, is it an attractive idea for intellectuals?
I'm not so sure if it's too strong in the Nationalist Party. But of course, Atilla İlhan, whom I mentioned, is who we can call left Kemalist from, the left nationalist. He seemed to have liked Sultan Galiyev very much. He emphasized Sultan Galiyev, and he might be one of the, you know, people who would, I mean, he's long passed away, but he might have supported this kind of idea. Among the nationalists, I mean, sure, there's not more interest in the Turks there, not Russia itself, as far as I know. But it's definitely an interesting idea. It's out there. I'm not so sure if it's too strong and popular, but it's there. And at least the fact that Durgan is translated probably means something.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Before concluding, I'd just like to say that I had a great pleasure. And there's, as I said, a million questions. I'd just like to have some remarks. As you've been talking about the complexity of modern Turkish identity, you probably cannot imagine how similar it is to the development of the Serbian identity. Is it a more broader, more imperial, or more local? And I think it runs deep within the consciousness of ordinary people. You have this in literature with Stevan Sremac as a novelist, but also I know this from my close ancestors, relatives. So usual Serbs, they divided the whole world only into three nations. Serbs, Turks and Germans. So Russian emperor is of course a Serb because he has the Serbian religion. And really you have this in novels, Popčire Pospira. And all of the Islamic world, they are all Turks obviously, and the whole West, the collective West, are Germans. So French and they're all Germans. So this says a lot, and also I think there is, when I meet with somebody from Syria, I like to say, oh, we used to live in the same country for centuries. And I'm not only meaning the Ottoman Empire, but also the Eastern Roman Empire.
True.
And there is something to it. And I think the remnants of this imperial identity you have specifically, in my opinion, with the two groups in the Balkans. It is the Serbs and the Bosniak Muslims. And both see the same city as the center, not geographically, but let's say transcendentally, as the center of their identity. It is Istanbul or Constantinople. So Serbs, see the Byzantine Empire, because the Serbian Empire of the 14th century was pretending to, it was trying to actually inherit the Greek Empire, the Byzantine Empire. And then, of course, the Bosniak Muslims see the Ottoman Empire as the same. So there is a very similar, the mechanisms, these mental mechanisms, and also everybody has their losses. When you spoke about loss of territory, loss of wars, this is all very shared, obviously, in different periods. But I must say, I think I speak on behalf of everybody who was present, that this was really a fascinating lecture, and if it's judging by this one, I think we will have a very fruitful year as the Institute of European Studies. Thank you again.
Okay, who has time, please join us for some drink.